Oracle of the Forgotten, the final betrayal of the Elder Kings. The Betrayer King returned to rule over his people. During that time, he'd done all he could to hide the fact that his wife had become with child. He was filled with joy, but also a deep worry came to his mind. There was no peace with the ancient gods. The elves and dwarves had lost many of their leaders as well. The younger gods and their young race of winged children began to fight against one another. Eventually, the elders stepped in, cutting down their numbers by half before demanding they find some way to sort their behavior. The young winged children decided to find their peace. Some delved in the dark realms for their own new start. Others remained in the light. It was the first of 2 great wars among their kind, but that can be spoken of later. The betrayer wasn't sure what he had to do to preserve his own people. As a final effort, he demanded audience with the Council of Ancient Gods and all other races who were willing to attend. He wanted to find some measure of peace for their future. One final attempt to prevent the senseless slaughter that he knew could still come. To remove all hesitation from the others, he told them that this was to discuss the future and freedoms of each of the councils. He suggested they could have their own dominions and realms if they could make the proper arrangements. Before he left, he ordered the throne of the Elder Kings to be moved to the realms of nothingness, to a chamber which only those of the void can reach. The reasons for this were initially unknown. In the future, perhaps he could reveal it, but for now it stood as his final tool to address the ancient councils. He claimed removing the throne of elders was an attempt to unify the councils and the kings, a last chance to try to have peace. At least, he hoped for that. Perhaps futile, but he hoped they could find any way to bring peace to his people and the universe again. During the meeting, he was pulled outside to speak to his personal guard. This one was one of his greatest warriors and should not have been within the realm of ancients. For a moment, his soul sank. He already knew what his friend would say. His heart was suddenly filled with a sense of pain. His entire figure fell into a shadow that drew in the light. Impossible. She was too much of a warrior to simply disappear. She had been trained by both her father and himself. She was in no way able to be taken down so easily. Not her. In that moment, he felt the entire sky had fallen upon him, until his mind softly whispered with her voice, "I'm traveling to you." Her words nearly made him drop everything, but there was no way to find where she was now. She traveled with energies he could never access or understand fully. Her ways and his were a universe apart, yet they danced so well together. Having no other recourse, he sent his guard away again to find out what had happened. The king returned to the room where the meeting was being held and told them sternly that as long as there was a king on the throne of elders, they would agree to follow that king's rule. In exchange, they could manage their own realms, but if they broke the laws, there would be dire consequences. The words sent chills through many of the members in attendance. They'd already seen what the kings could do. His voice had taken the same tone as the wrath of the warnings of the old king. They agreed, wearing the oath upon any generations of their kind, all ancient gods, all other beings, all of the younger gods and their creations. If a king were upon the elder throne, they would follow their rules. If a true king could waken the throne of the elders, they would not be disputed nor challenged unless they violated the ancient laws. That king would be obligated to remove themselves, or the universe itself would remove them. The king began to explain to them what the signs would be of the throne accepting a new king. He made them swear upon their very souls to build a meeting hall, a palace of his design to house it, a design he'd already submitted to their builders and many of them in the hours before this meeting. He was aching and having difficulty hiding a sense of ill-ease that was quickly growing within his being. He knew something was not quite right. Still, the ancients agreed to his terms. With that, he swore them to an oath that would either break their soul or allow the remaining elders to know and hunt the violators to the end of eternity. He was about to speak again when he suddenly felt a tearing pull from the depths. It was as if every fiber of his being was torn asunder. The weight of it was something he couldn't imagine or even explain. It was so painful, all-penetrating. Every fragment of his entire soul wanted to cry out suddenly. For a brief moment, he froze in place. This had never happened before. All the energy surrounding him was drained from the room. The space around him grew colder by the moment as he struggled to regain his composure. He drew in more energy, anything that was free-flowing through this space. Darker, deeper, not even the light of the ancient gods could compare to the shadows being drawn into his soul. Some even found themselves beginning to grow weaker simply with his presence. Many stepped back now, uncertain of their own futures. The king said nothing else. In that moment, nothing mattered. He simply left the room and, using all the power he could bring to himself, drew his body inside the void. He shifted, fragmenting himself into a billion points of energy inside of nothingness, the space between energy, the space that touched everything but did not exist, the space that he knew best of all as his home. He moved so quickly to the side of his beloved that his appearance shook the room. A crack like thunder sounded as he burst forth from the void back to the energetic reality. She was alone, terribly wounded but covered in blood and the wrong color to be her own. Shimmering golden blue, fragments of some energy he was unfamiliar with. None of that mattered to him. He focused his attention solely on her. Within a moment, he was trying to hold together her fading form, focusing his own energy into drawing the crystals of her being back into some manner of focus, to bring back the essence of her energy. But he knew her core had shattered, and her end was coming swiftly. She was already fading, her energy wrapping tendrils around her small form as she cradled the belly where their unborn had rested. As he tried to repair her, she had no focus other than the child that she wanted to bring into this world. She was drawing in all the power she could, her essence and energy forming a shell around what was left of her womb. She tore at the fabric of the universe around them, the walls shivering and collapsing as parts of their structure broke away to finish her last creation. Plants wilted, then faded to dust. The river of the universe, the very depths of it, was torn aside, pulled out of the space where it feeds all energy as an effort to save them. The world shattered around them, the ground itself splitting as she formed an egg-like shell around what was left of her fragmenting, dissolving womb. The unborn remained safe, comforted in what was left of her energy, and cradled in the memory of her eternities. A part of her wished she could see this one grow up, but she knew. There was no more retaining herself. Even a creator could not undo what was done. Even devouring the entire universe might not be enough to hold her together. The effort was continued. letting the growing sphere of light draw in the shadows, filling it up with creative and void energies. She began to pour into it with love, the sound of her voice, the song of her soul, the song of her name, which was already being stricken from the reality. She prayed that whoever the child was within would remember her, perhaps share her voice or memories of her powers, that she could visit them in their dreams. She pleaded with the highest powers to at least allow the little one to reside in peace, or to become the one to create it again. It may seem like a heavy weight to place on an unborn, but she hoped for their sake that this would be the end of all this suffering. She'd begun to shake, barely able to hold herself up from the floor now. She couldn't feel her beloved's arms wrapping around her. A part of her head was missing. The long white hair that had once shimmered like stardust was now a muted silver, growing darker by the moment. Her blue-green eyes no longer showed stars and galaxies swirling within them, only an ever-growing darkness. She was fading into the dust of stars, even as the husband tried with all his power to bring her back. Finally, he took the sphere into his hands as it pulsed and glowed like a small, underdeveloped star. His eyes grew so cold that even the old king would have trembled. He reached into the essence of nothing to call forth his servant. It was the only chance he had to keep the unborn from those who had caused him such pain. The only way to keep them from becoming a target after what he would now do. He would recover the star later. For now, though, as his servant arrived, he was met with a single demand: move it further to safety. This man was the only left that he knew that he could trust. Once he saw his guard walk through the portal, he began to focus again. Reaching within the essence of the void beside him, he pulled out an all-too-familiar armor. It attached to him directly, adhering to his body as it began to reshape itself around the cold rage fueling him. He no longer needed a target. He had countless. As soon as he placed the helmet on his head, he reached into the air for the sword. The blade of the old king felt cold in his hand. The metal was dark and menacing, fueled with ages of blood and warfare, but rested unscathed as it had been reforged with the soul of the old king now bound to it forever. Ice formed around it, freezing a glistening blue flame across the surface. Blue flares of the blade returned quickly, mixing with the deep black cruelty of the destroyer. The man smiled, but there wasn't a joy in it. It was cold, calculated, sadistic. In that moment, he reached up to form a message to his people. If any know me again, I am no longer king. Know me as the destroyer. For the final betrayal of the ancient gods shall not go unpunished, and equally neither shall any of you who were involved. The voice came from the air, the minds surrounding every living creature in the realms. The beasts grew agitated, unable to understand what was happening. The great scales began to transition their nests and flights to safer places. Those who could not be moved were guarded with the utmost care. Soon, they too would be moved to a space between, until the universe stopped collapsing. While they had no part in this, they knew the magnitude of this threat, even to their own kind. The coming weeks would be nothing short of carnage. The soul of the old king allowed itself to manifest within the presence of the destroyer, as if each half of his body were a separate man, but working together flawlessly with the skills and abilities of both. Nearly all of the ancient council fell to the conjoined power and rage of the two kings. When they could find no more of the council, they began to raze the villages and cities of the nearby ancients. The guards of the younger gods stepped in, trying to bring as many of the race as possible to the next realm. It was difficult. They had to pull whatever energy was left from the last of their creators. None seemed to have enough power on their own. Many of the ancient creators exhausted their own souls to nothingness to bring about this passage into the new universe. The universe had nothing within it at the moment, as they were fully unprepared. Or it should have had nothing? With the powers they had, the promised castle had been built, the first and only structure that existed within the realm. Yet somehow this structure was not alone. As the gods continued to move their refuge, they became more aware of how bright it was beginning to grow. Inside the old universe, the carnage continued until nearly every one of the elder race had fallen as well. Anyone who remained in the realms after the transition was hunted systematically. The two could not be satiated. They would not be until a voice screamed through the remaining energy of all that was. The last echoes of the universe itself as it began closing in on them, growing ever smaller. The voice spoke. "It is done. Save the star." The pair paused, their energies extended, seeking with whatever power and strength was left. For only a brief moment they heard the cry of the only star. Something had entered its presence. Something lingered nearby. Something that felt foreign to it, frightening. It shouldn't even be conscious yet. Having no more strength to even lift the blade of the old king, the destroyer tied it to himself. The exhausted presence of the old king retreated back in the blade, as he still had not fully recovered from his transition. The destroyer's many wounds were now evident. The armor had been holding him together against the onslaught of impossible, perhaps even fatal attacks. It was all depleted now. Even the shimmer was beginning to fade. He cursed, and then took the biggest risk he could imagine. He traveled again, with the very last of his energy, to where the unborn was hidden. The gods and new races had come to their sanctuary in an entirely new universe. They took all of the land surrounding their old castle. With their magic, they'd already finished reconstructing it into an incredibly tall tower, surrounded by a courtyard and the lands about. It all floated within this new universe, one they could create to their own design. Everything was empty. The universe hadn't been fully formed past the void that had started within. Everything was new, nothingness. Only, what then was this light? What was the source of this energy? An energy that tied to the old universe. An energy that drew in, feeding off the river of eternal flow, the force of creation itself. The ancients glanced out to the star, their eyes widening in an amount of horror at the realization. After all, they'd seen it when the king declared his final war upon them. They had been shown it in the scrying glass of the ancient oracle. It was the star, the child of the destroyer. The ancients demanded that the oracle step forward. Among the last of the eldritch beasts, she was capable of seeing 1,000 realities at once, or so they said. The oracle was not so keen on being drawn out of her solitude. She glanced at the energies surrounding her, then back to the voice of the gods. Within resides creation and destruction. Within is death and life. She stayed quiet a moment, then the gods urged her onward. She didn't care for it. She'd always seen them as pushy beings that needed to be tamed. Know the blood of kings will end all if crossed. It was a simple enough fact. If anything, they'd just experienced it. She was struck hard, knocked to the floor by one of the remaining members of the ancient council. He berated her for her mockery. He wanted no more to do with her words. Still, his own advisor spoke to the oracle again, begging to know what could be done. Make a decision, and ask me again when the death returns. She said nothing more. Instead, she rose from the floor and reached her hands outward. She removed herself quickly from the room, her physical blindness hardly hindering her from walking along her path. After all, who needs eyes when they can see all of the realities? The gods were not comforted at all by her words, but what choice did they have? They chose to wait. The star was no different than an egg. With time, it would hatch. When it did, they would collect whatever child had been created by the destroyer. They would never let them know they were an elder, least of all the king of them. When the time came, the betrayer knew well what his choice had to be. As he pondered the star himself, he knew he could never fully save what was within. He rested a moment, thinking on how to save his heirs when it hit him. There was not just one. He was almost instantly aware that there was a choice that had to be made, but how does one choose a fate like this for their own child? He didn't have much time left either. With more energy than ever in the voided space that he had left them, there was no way to prevent what was to soon come. He made his decision, maybe based on his own fears, maybe based on the past. He waited. When the time was right, a messenger from the ancients came to collect the children within the great egg. To his surprise, it was not only a messenger, but someone he had once called a friend, at least as close as could be considered. The destroyer knew he could only trust so much, but made the arrangements as he had decided. He took the girl child and handed off the boy. He refused to acknowledge the fact that his power was currently depleted. Rather, he said this was the last offering of peace between their people. An oath between them sealed their agreement. Never would one communicate what the betrayer had done. There would be nothing mentioned of the girl child, and with that, the two departed ways for the last time. The destroyer had trusted the other man to watch over his son. With the way the ancients had treated the women of their kind, there was no way he could leave his daughter in such danger. Still, he was too weak for a true battle. He only hoped that his energy would recover soon so that he could claim the lost part of his family. He could only hope they didn't turn him against his own blood. All he could do was protect and teach this little one and hope the strength returned to go and seek the second child.